One of the main topics of pillars is leadership, and an important role in leadership is managing your team. When we talk about leadership, oftentimes we talk about vision and faith and creativity, and as much as those are important, managing people becomes very important as you lead your team. Jesus gave us a model of how he managed his team, his 12 disciples. And that model for us is in Luke chapter 9. And we're going to look at the 7 steps that Jesus took in managing his team that we can learn how to manage our teams most effectively. The model begins in Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 1 and 2. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. Jesus brings all of his disciples together, and when he sends them out making them rely on God. He gives them an authority and he gives them a power, but they have to trust that God will show up. He is asking them to do something that is beyond their capacity. And we need to understand that part of our role in managing our teams is not so much building their self-esteem so they can feel like they are capable, but it's building their trust in God. Oftentimes, we will find ourselves as leaders wanting to encourage people and edify people, and we build them up with our language. And that's okay. But I want to caution you that if you spend too much of your time trying to build people up in their own capacity, they will find themselves depending on themselves. Jesus began by building the disciples up in their need to trust God. We have to get our people to rely on God more than they rely on themselves. There's a story in the Old Testament of where Moses is called on by God to go set the Israelites free, and Moses' response to God is, I can't do this. And you would think God would come alongside of Moses and encourage him and build him up and say, sure, Moses, you can do this. But God doesn't do that. All God says to Moses is this, I will be with you. As a leader, managing our team, we want to get them to a place where they are trusting that God will be with them in the role that they have been asked to carry out. And the best way that you can build trust in your team and in the members of that team is through experience. You have to position them just like Jesus positioned the disciples, where they will be doing something a bit beyond their capacity. You must use wisdom in this. But too oftentimes, as leaders managing our teams, we protect them from those moments of risk and stepping outside of their comfort zone. Jesus begins by leading his team to a place where they have to be fully dependent upon God. But then he moves on. Look at verse 3 of Luke chapter 9. He told them, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. He is managing them by sending them out. He gets them to depend on God. But then he gives them very clear directions. This is the second step of his leadership management model, that when you are leading a team, you must give them clear directions. Oftentimes when we are leading a team and the team doesn't seem to be working hard like we would like them to, we get frustrated with them. We think they are lazy, but they're not actually lazy. They're just confused. They haven't been given clear directions. And here Jesus is very clear. He tells them what to take. He tells them where to go. He tells them what they should be doing. And in these clear directions, the disciples can go forward. The best way you will manage your team is making sure you are giving them clear directions. And the best way you will know that your directions are clear is, first of all, keep your directions short. Sometimes our directions are just too many words and it gets cluttered and people don't understand the priorities. Be clear by being short. But then also you will know if you are clear by making sure your team repeats back to you the directions you have given them. And when you listen to how they repeat back to you your directions, you will know if you have been clear. Jesus' model of management, of leading a team, involves giving very clear directions. But then he goes on. If you look at verses 4 through 5, it says this, whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off of your feet as a testimony against them. This is a really interesting part of Jesus' model of managing people. He's sending them into villages, he's giving them clear directions, but then he says this, when you get there and failure happens, he actually tells them the story of something going wrong and how they need to respond when it doesn't work what they want to accomplish. Jesus is doing what I call truth-telling. He is creating a story that the disciples will be in and that they can see themselves in. Oftentimes, as leaders managing teams, all we do is speak so positively, so futuristically wonderfully, that we never prepare them for some of the hardships they're going to face. We actually send them out a bit naively or idealistically. But Jesus truly gives them an understanding that not everything will work. This becomes a really important management principle. We have to redefine how we talk about failure. That failure is not something that will not happen. Failure is not something that is always bad. Failure challenges struggles. That is part of being in ministry. And if we can prepare our people for the reality that they will have some challenges and some struggles, then we will be able to see them respond much better when those failures take place. We need to redefine the idea of failure, just like Jesus does with his disciples, so that when they go out, they're ready and have managed expectations. Jesus doesn't end there. He goes on in verses 5. He says this, so they set out together and went from village to village, proclaiming good news and healing people everywhere. Jesus' management style of the people was never to send anybody alone. He never had his team be isolated. He always sent them at least in pairs. And he did this because he wanted to protect them from having to try to figure things out alone. When you manage your team, and your team may be 10 people or 12 people or even more, never see them as just one team and never see them individually, but see them as pairs that can be sent out so they are together in what they're doing. Part of the best role of a leader in managing people is understanding that your leadership is not just by your great stature, but it's how you connect people together. There are illustrations of this in the New Testament. One of the best leaders in the New Testament was a man by the name of Barnabas. There are no leadership books written about Barnabas, but the book of Acts tells us how Barnabas went and he got Saul, who would become Paul, and he got the apostles, and he brought them together. He was a connector. He knew that for God's ministry to go forward, these two groups of people had to be connected. If you're going to be a good leader managing your team, you have to know who to connect to who so that when they go out together, they will be fruitful. Philip was another great leader that we rarely see as a leader because Philip was an inviter. He was always inviting people into the mix, and being a good manager is about inviting the right people into the right teams. Oftentimes when ministry has struggles, it's because we haven't led the people effectively, and what we have done is not put them in the right groupings together. Jesus doesn't just send the disciples out. He sends them out in precise teams. This is his leadership that he gives to us as a manager. He gets them to trust God. He gives them clear directions. He paints for them a picture of possible hardships and difficulties. He sends them out in teams, and yet he's not quite done yet. Look at verse 10. When the apostles returned, so they go to the villages, they do the ministry they've been asked to do, and then they come back to him. And verse 10 says that when they returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. Look carefully at what Jesus does in his leadership over his team. They go out and they do their tasks, much like you have teams that will go out and they will do the tasks that you set before them. But then when they come back and they report to him, Jesus does not quickly move on. He understands that there is a moment here, a moment for coaching, a moment for teaching, a moment to help the disciples what had happened. And look carefully at how he manages this debrief moment with the disciples. He doesn't do it immediately. He waits. Why does he wait? Because oftentimes as leaders, we try to teach and coach and debrief in the heat of the moment. And usually in the heat of the moment, right when a project is ongoing, emotions are very high. Intensity is very high. And Jesus knows that if my disciples are going to grow in their leadership and in their ministry, I need to speak to them when they're not in an emotionally charged moment. So he waits. He doesn't just wait, he takes them away. They go away to a village called Bethsaida. So they are removed from that situation they were in for ministry. There is something important in this model, that if we're going to manage our teams well, we need to make sure that we carve out time to be able to coach them and teach them based on their experience, but we have to wait. Sometimes we have to remove them. And then I think Jesus has a discussion with them. They don't just turn in reports via email. He sits down with them and he talks to them and he asks them questions. And he uses this precise moment to train them. Be a leader in managing your team who takes many opportunities to gather them together, to take them away, to ask them questions. And don't let the debrief just be a programming debrief about was it successful or was it not successful. Let it be a debrief where you are teaching them about their leadership and about their gifting, about their faith in God. Too oftentimes, we are so busy, driven by programs, that we quickly move from one program to another event, and we do not take the time that Jesus took to do this. You have to prioritize this. It's very easy just to push through. It's very easy to only have a debrief when there are problems. But the debriefing part of our leadership with our teams needs to be a constant, always thing that we do, because it allows us to speak into our team and guide their development. Now, Jesus is not done yet. As you continue on in verse 13 of Luke chapter 9, we move to another story that is being recorded by Luke, but it's all part of this process that's being taught to us. And this is where there are thousands of people, and Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, "You feed them." You see, he's moving them on to another stage of development, another stage of faith from where they were early on in the chapter. Here's what it says in verse 13. Jesus replied to them. They had come to him and said, "We don't have enough food. We don't have enough money. There's thousands of people." And he looks at them and he says, "You give them something to eat." Jesus is challenging the growth of the disciples from just going to a village and sharing the gospel to now being a part of a miracle. Oftentimes as leaders, we make the mistake of just maintaining our people where they're at. If they're good and they're doing a good job, we just keep them in that state. Jesus never did that with his disciples. His management of his team was to always advance them, to always move them forward. Wherever they were at, there was another step that they could move forward in. And then as they moved forward into that step, there was another step that they could move forward in. Jesus did not tell the disciples what their life and ministry would look like 20 steps down the road. He did not tell the disciples that they would be authors of the Holy Scriptures. He did not tell the disciples that they would be pillars in the kingdom of God. He did not tell the disciples that most of them would be martyred for their faith. All he did was tell them, here's your next step of advancement. We do one of two extremes. We either just keep them where they're at, maintaining the status quo, but then they never grow into all that they can do for Christ and in your work, or we only paint for them a picture so far down the road that it seems unachievable or too hard to even begin to understand. We need to follow the model of Jesus, who took them from where they were to the next step, From go into the village and preach the gospel to you feed them. And as a leader managing your team, you look at your team members and you ask yourself the question, what's their next step of development? What's their next step of growth? And how do I position them for this next step of growth? In Luke 9, and I encourage you to study this chapter with greater depth, in Luke 9, we have a pattern of Jesus' leadership and management over his team. And it's given to us as an example and a model for our management over our team. And we can kind of do a self-assessment. Do we match up to Jesus? He got them to trust God in what he was asking them to do. Are we making them too self-reliant? And do we need to reposition them at a place of faith where they need to trust God for their role in ministry? Then Jesus gave them incredibly clear directions. Are your directions clear? Could your team repeat it back to you? Then when he was telling them what was going to happen, he actually did some truth telling and told them some scenarios that weren't very positive because he wanted them fully prepared for what would happen. And he was honest with them and painted a story that they could see themselves in. Do you do that full truth telling where they begin to trust you more because of your honesty and they're equipped for that? Then he put them in teams. And he knew that part of his leadership role was connecting the right people together so that as teams, they could be successful. But it was really hard for many of us to follow the last part of Jesus' model, which was to take time to debrief with them, to take them away, to ask questions, to understand their experience, to coach them and to teach them to do more. Are you creating that time for your team to be able to do that? Because it's in that debrief moment that you best get an understanding of what their next step of growth is, which is what Jesus gave the disciples when he said, you feed them. This pattern that Luke 9 gives us is a pattern of Jesus' leadership, but it doesn't quite end at verse 13. At the end of the chapter, actually, there's a conversation that Jesus has with the disciples, and it's read to us in verse 18. It says this: once Jesus was praying in private, and his disciples were with him, and he asked them, who do the crowd say I am? But who do you say I am? Jesus' Luke 9 pattern ends with pointing his disciples to a deeper awareness and a deeper identity with himself. As leaders following Jesus' model, sometimes we can be so driven by the task our teams are supposed to be doing, managing the programs that they're supposed to be executing, that we lose sight of this final part of Jesus' model. That our primary responsibility is to point our team members to Jesus. Who do you say I am? Because as our team members following this whole model find themselves more reliant on Jesus, more aware of Jesus, closer to Jesus, they are positioned not only for their own growth, but for how God will use them in serving alongside of you in the ministry. Luke 9 is an incredible model that Jesus gives us as to how we should lead and manage our teams. Follow that model, and you will see his fruitfulness in your ministry and in your people.